All right, guys. This week we're going to be covering the autonomic nervous system. And I just got this recording software downloaded and everything, so I hope the video records smoothly, the audio records smoothly, and let me know if there's any issues accessing these videos. Just to explain to you how we're going to break it down, we're going to do, I plan on doing 4 separate videos. This first video is just going to be an introduction, and so a lot of the material will run over into each other, but I have it all compressed into one PowerPoint, which I uploaded onto LCMS. So this first video will cover the first, 10 to 15 slides. And then I have my learning objectives at the very end. All right, let's get to it. So this is a link to Khan Academy videos, and I'll have a couple links posted throughout the PowerPoint if you want to take a look at them. This is if you need a general refresher on rest and digest versus fight or flight. I will say a lot of the test questions in this class and in medical school and on boards, if you can stop and think rest and digest and fight or flight, I know it's cliche, but it really helps to narrow down a lot of your answers, because you can just think what's happening in a rest and digest state and a fight or flight state. So as an example, just a quick question to start off: which of the following effects does not occur during the fight or flight response? And so if you just think it one by one and just think about what's happening. So A, airways increase in diameter, lungs are confusing, so let's ignore that one for one. B, heart rate speeds up, so we know that definitely occurs, right? Because the question is asking what does not occur. So we can cross that out. Pupils constrict, let's come back to that later. Blood pressure increases, that definitely happens. And the blood vessels, the skeletal muscles dilate. So that definitely happens because in a fight or flight, your blood is going to shunt away from your visceral organs and your skeletal muscles. So we know it's either A or C, and a sympathetic fight or flight response actually causes bronchodilation. So the airways do increase in diameter, so it's not A. And so we know that the pupils do not constrict during a fight or flight response. Okay, this is just to keep in mind. We're going to be narrowing in on specific regions of the spinal cord and organs and stuff like that. But just keep this in mind, the centers upstairs really do control everything. And if you think about it, it makes sense because they're constantly receiving feedback from the periphery, processing it, and then sending an output back to regulate homeostasis and everything. So mainly it's the hypothalamus and brainstem. The hypothalamus is extremely important for sympathetic input and output, so just keep that in mind. Okay, so Dr. O'Brien will be teaching your nervous system course, and I asked her if it was okay to steal a couple of slides from her PowerPoint presentation. This is just something to keep in mind. So somatic, remember we're talking about the efferent output, like think skeletal muscle, afferent, but what we're really going to be focused on with autonomics is the visceral system. So visceral output, and remember that efferent is exiting the central nervous system. So it goes to the smooth and cardiac muscle and glands, and then afferent is input back into the central nervous system, giving it information about what's going on. And that comes in the form of pain. For instance, abdominal distension always goes back up via the vagus nerve and tells the brain what's going on. So just big picture stuff to keep in mind. I forgot to delete the slide. So the learning objectives are actually at the end of the slide, or end of the presentation. Okay, one thing I want you to definitely know is the origins of each system. So the sympathetic nervous system is also called thoracolumbar. And definitely remember this term, the IML. It stands for intermediolateral cell column. And T1 to L2, some places will have T1 to L3. You'll see both, but that's important to remember. That's why it's called thoracolumbar, T1 to L2. And this is actually one of the ways you can tell if a spinal cord is cut in cross-section. You can tell that it's from one of these sections, for instance, and not C1 or C2 or L5 because there'll be a little outpouching of the gray matter, and this houses the cell bodies for the sympathetic preganglionic neurons. The origins of the parasympathetic nervous system, just have to memorize this. You might already know this, but 3, 7, 9, 10, do whatever you need to remember that, but definitely memorize that. And it's also called craniosacral because it comes from the brainstem, cranio, and then sacral S2 through S4. All right, so this is, I'm not sure if you know who Dr. Goulian is, but he used to teach here at OSU. And he has this phrase, remember one, the other one's the other one. This will absolutely save you during medical school. I had some classmates that tried to memorize everything, and it's just too much. So, if you remember one, the other one's the other one. So I want you to get really familiar with the terms. For instance, it can sound like a mouthful, but parasympathetic preganglionic, parasympathetic postganglionic. So be familiar with the terms. Most times, with the exception being the adrenal medulla, the sympathetic nervous systems will have short preganglionic neurons and long postganglionic neurons. And, remember one, the other one's the other one. The parasympathetic is going to be the opposite. It'll have long, heavily myelinated preganglionic neurons and short postganglionic neurons. And just a refresher on the terminology, a ganglion is just a cluster of neuronal cell bodies. So there's a cell body here, and then there's a preganglionic neuron, there's a synapse with another cell body, and then there's a postganglionic neuron, and then there's a synapse at the effector organ. So the parasympathetic, sympathetic are two neuron systems. That's really important, two neuron systems. There's cell body that starts it, and then there's a synapse in the middle, kind of like the middleman, and then there's a second neuron that goes to the effector organ. Let's see here. And the adrenal medulla is different because it has a longer preganglionic neuron, and then the chromaffin cells in the adrenal gland really act as kind of similar to the sympathetic chain where the synapse takes place. And then this is just in comparison. Somatic system is a one neuron system, right? So all these two neuron system, and this is a one neuron system. All right, I think that's all I want to talk about. Remember, short sympathetic preganglionic, long sympathetic postganglionic. All right, the next thing I want to talk about is the difference in the effector molecules. And what I mean by effector molecules is the neurotransmitters. So one thing that's you can know right away is that ask yourself, what's the same? All of these preganglionic neurons and the one neuron system of the somatic nervous systems release acetylcholine, and it binds to a nicotinic receptor. So if you have a question on a preganglionic neurotransmitter that's released, it doesn't matter what system you're talking about, parasympathetic, sympathetic, whatever. It's always acetylcholine, and it always binds to a nicotinic receptor. And then the next question to ask is, what is different? Parasympathetic, postganglionic, and remember, I don't want to confuse you, but you have to look very closely at the questions to see if I'm asking about pre-ganglionic or post-ganglionic. So the parasympathetic postganglionic neurons release acetylcholine, right? So these are the same, just pretty simple. And it binds to a muscarinic receptor. This is different. So the preganglionic acetylcholine binds to a nicotinic receptor here. The postganglionic neuron sends its axons down, releases acetylcholine as well, but it binds to a muscarinic receptor, and that will be, depending on the organ, it'll be M1, M2, or M3, and they're the different subtypes of muscarinic receptors. Regarding the sympathetic nervous system, This is the classic, adrenaline, fight or flight. Right? It's norepinephrine usually, norepinephrine. And there's going to be what's called adrenergic receptors. And the term adrenergic applies anytime you see alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1, beta 2, and the subpopulation of these receptors will vary depending on the target organ. So for instance, beta 1 is in the heart. And if there's sympathetic activity, there's going to be norepinephrine binding to beta 1 receptors in the heart. And when the beta 1 receptor is bound by an agonist, it's going to increase contractility, increase heart rate, and get your blood pumping for the situation. The adrenal gland is really unique in the sense that, like I said, it has a longer preganglionic neuron. It actually synapses very similar to how the postganglionic neurons of the parasympathetic nervous system synapse. So this is what's called, I'll just put IM, because this is called an intramural ganglion, and intramural just means inside the wall. So this preganglionic neuron is going to go all the way until it gets to the adrenal gland and the synapse, specifically the chromaffin cells. Acetylcholine is going to bind a nicotinic receptor, and then the adrenal gland is going to be stimulated to release epinephrine and norepinephrine in this kind of 4-to-1 ratio. And something interesting, cortisol is actually required for the conversion of, I think it's norepinephrine to epinephrine, but that's a relationship between the stress pathway and the sympathetic pathway. And then, you know this from last week, acetylcholine binds nicotinic receptor for skeletal muscle contraction. And I kind of already talked about this, so skip this. Okay, this is also from Dr. O'Brien. This is a nice summary slide. Just remember the different divisions, where the preganglionic neuronal cell bodies come from, and then where the postganglionic neuronal cell bodies are located. And we'll talk more about this in each of these systems, but just remember these postganglionic synapses regarding the sympathetic nervous system. They can happen in a lot of different places. The most popular is what's going to be called the sympathetic chain. The sympathetic chain is also called the paravertebral ganglia. And be comfortable with the terminology. Don't get confused between para and pre. Paravertebral is alongside the spine, and the prevertebral ganglia is located more in the abdomen. So there's the celiac ganglion, also the inferior mesenteric ganglion, and the superior mesenteric ganglion. And then, like I talked about, this kind of unique exception, the postganglionic synapse actually happens, and this is the only time really that there's a situation like this in the sympathetic nervous system. It happens in the adrenal medulla itself. Parasympathetic postganglionic synapses happen in the wall, like I said, remember that intramural term, in the wall, intramural, or near effector organs, and they're going to be literally right next to the target organ. So even though it's a 2-neuron system in the parasympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic is so long that it travels all the way to right beside the target organ, and in some cases inside the target organ. Okay, let's do some practice questions to finish up here. Okay, so a postganglionic neuron. This is just a general question about postganglionic neurons. Do they have myelinated axons? Release neurotransmitter at the effector cell is the first part of the autonomic pathway, so we know that's wrong, right, because it's the second part. Has its cell body in the brain or spinal cord? Has its axons exiting the CNS through cranial nerves? So it's not E, right, because that's characteristic of preganglionic. Remember the craniosacral term, so it is not D, because that's also a characteristic of a preganglionic neuron. It is A is kind of, I don't really like that, because A is kind of tricky, because depending where you're talking about, it can be myelinated, it might not be, but since they're not always myelinated, it's not A either. But even if we were confused, we would know for sure that B has to be right, because it releases a neurotransmitter at the effector cell. And that's always the case, no matter parasympathetic or sympathetic nervous system. These normally have the shortest preganglionic axons. So what did I talk about? Sympathetic nervous system has short preganglionic. And think however you want to remember it, SNS, whatever. But the answer is definitely D. And acetylcholine binds to muscarinic, nicotinic, alpha, or a combination of answers. So it's not alpha, because what binds here is norepinephrine. And nicotinic receptors, yes. Muscarinic receptors, yes. So A and B are correct. And remember, nicotinic, skeletal muscle, and muscarinic is pretty much everywhere else, like all the organs that receive postganglionic innervation of the parasympathetic nervous system. Which of the following sympathetic responses is mismatched with its body part? So let's cross out the ones that are matched correctly. The iris of the eye, dilation of the pupil, that's right, because in a fight or flight response, wide eyes, dilation of the pupil. Liver, increased glycogen synthesis. So part of the sympathetic response is actually to mobilize glucose into the circulation. So this is going to be the correct answer, because sympathetic response would actually prefer to break down glycogen into glucose to mobilize glucose for the body. So sympathetic in the stomach, decreased motility. Hair follicles, contraction of rectal pili, and adipose, increased lipolysis. So A, C, D, and E are all examples of sympathetic functions, and that would make B the mismatched answer. All right, so next video I'll talk about the sympathetic nervous system.